Halfland, an ahistorical prehistory. Part 23. Inguldrifa Indignant. As the summer of the 165th year of the Common Reckoning turned to autumn, Inguldrifa, the Lady of Unnascrag, departed from the hill-hold, heading for South Vale. Her path ran through the heart of the Geitsmark, which was at that time in a state of turmoil. Inguldrifa's spear dwarves had recently slain Halfred, the king of the Geitsmark, at the Battle of Wolfswade. His son and heir Halgi had succeeded to the throne, but the crown did not sit securely on his head. Preoccupied with eliminating those who opposed his rule, Halgi neglected to pay the returning remnants of Halfred's defeated army, now a disjointed and confused rabble. Beggared bands of erstwhile dwarvish soldiery wandered the countryside, supporting themselves by banditry. And so it was that Inguldrifa and her travelling companions were beset by ruffians on the road. The attackers were driven off, but not before many of Inguldrifa's retinue had been slain. Despite the absence of any evidence that would support such an hypothesis, Inguldrifa was convinced that she had survived a deliberate attempt to assassinate her, an attempt that had been personally planned by Halgi. Although she was shaken by this incident, Inguldrifa pushed on to South Vale. Her 10-year-old grandson, Gunni, had inherited the Silvermere mines on the death of Inguldrifa's daughter, Ingulfrid, earlier that year. Hundi, a nephew of Inguldrifa's deceased husband Bardi, was challenging Ingulfrid's will. The case was to be decided by the Council of Guildsmen, which was based in South Vale. Inguldrifa's purpose in coming to South Vale was to ensure that the council ruled in Gunni's favour. Hundi had many business interests and many friends on the council, but Gunni was the mine lord. He had both wealth and spear dwarves, and Inguldrifa knew how to use them. The council ruled in Gunni's favour. Inguldrifa did not return south that winter. Instead, she headed north to Delvings, where she examined the operations and finances of the Silvermere mines. She then dispensed with the services of any of the mine officials whose books did not balance, or who had supported Hundi's cause, or who she considered to be too close to the Council of Guildsmen. On the other hand, those officials who generated large profits for the mine, and who had been loyal to Gunni, and who she believed would be loyal to her, were rewarded and promoted. She identified one particularly adept manager by the name of Skopti, who she dispatched south to the Dark Hills to oversee the operations of the mines there. While Inguldrifa was minding Gunni's business, Bina was minding matters back down south. Not that they needed much minding. At first he tarried in the Dark Hills, enjoying the profits generated by the mines that had been passed to him under the treaty Inguldrifa had agreed with Ulfgrim. But Bina did not find the austere atmosphere around the mines, which were worked using convict labour, to his taste. When Skopti arrived, Bina presented him with a company of spear dwarves, just in case there was any trouble, placed the mines entirely under his charge, and headed back to Unnascrag to take up the reins of administration there. But the dwarves of Unnascrag did not need or want much government, and so Bina spent most of his time in Unnascrag making merry. This suited him very well. However, his life was not all play and no work. In the spring of the 166th year of the Common Reckoning, his carousing was interrupted by the arrival of an envoy from Cadamos. The Cadamossians had provided troops to Inguldrifa to support her in her war against Ulfkill. In exchange, Inguldrifa had promised to provide troops to Cadamos for use against New Lixia. The Cadamossian envoy had come to collect on that promise. This presented Bina with a problem. The dwarves of Unnascrag were not particularly belligerent. Most of them had no interest in distant lands and no desire to visit them, particularly for the purpose of fighting other people's wars. The number of warriors that Bina could raise for foreign adventures was therefore limited, and most of them were already serving under Skopti in the Dark Hills. Bina scrabbled around and managed to scrape together 150 fighting dwarves, which he supplemented with 100 halfling mercenaries under the command of Magno Flagonfist. He then sent this improvised force to Cadamos, thus fulfilling Inguldrifa's promise. The king of Cadamos at that time was Kratinos, a youth in his 18th year, whose fervent desire was to wage war against Diadromes, the tyrant of New Lixia. This was largely a personal matter. Kratinos' maternal uncle, Telenos, had been the king of New Lixia until Diadromes had murdered him and usurped his throne. Kratinos' father, Kinas, had then marched on New Lixia with the intention of overthrowing the tyrant. That was not to be. Kinas had been slain by New Lixian swords at the Battle of Rushbank Reach. Kratinos was determined to avenge the deaths of his father and uncle, kill the usurper, and place Lysonos, the son of Telenos, in his rightful place on the throne of New Lixia. On the other hand, his mother, Kyra, was not so keen on the idea. She had already lost her brother and husband. She had no wish to see her elder son added to the list. But Kratinos assured her that there was nothing to worry about. Hundreds of doughty dwarves would be fighting at his side, and none could stand against their spears. And then Bina's miscellaneous contingent arrived. A mere 100 spear dwarves, accompanied by 150 assorted unarmoured missile troops, the majority of which were halflings. The Cadamossians were not impressed. They found the halflings particularly risible. Kyra prevailed on her son to change his plans. Rather than leading the entire army in an immediate assault on New Lixia, he would first make a reconnaissance in strength, detaching a sizable raiding party to probe the enemy's defences, test the combatability of the dwarves and halflings, and loot and plunder everything that hands could be laid on. And crucially from Kyra's perspective, Kratinos would remain in Cadamos, overseeing the muster of the main army, and delegate the leadership of the raid to a subordinate. The raiding party marched down the great river and started at its work. Diadromes hastily marshalled his forces and marched out to meet it. A battle was fought. The dwarves won great glory, and Diadromes was slain. 2 weeks later, Kratinos marched unopposed into New Lixia at the head of his army, Lysonos at his side. Diadromes had enriched himself at the expense of his subjects, who now lined the streets and cheered their liberators. Lysonos was crowned with due ceremony. The people rejoiced. One of the true bloodline of Krantos again sat upon the throne. Rightful order had been restored. Surely now the gods would smile upon them. And smile they did. Many better off New Lixians had emigrated to Midhaven or Cadamos, taking their riches with them, out of the reach of Diadrome's grasping fingers. And they had not been idle in their period of exile. They had made friends and entered into business relationships. Those who returned to New Lixia were now able to profit from those contacts. Trade boomed. Merchandise flowed through New Lixia. Goods of dwarvish manufacture were imported from Unnaskrag by way of Cadamos. For those of more limited means, goblin products were imported by way of Midhaven. And the ships that had belonged to Diadromes continued to sail out to Eldrixhaven and Royal Harbour and back again, loaded with halfling cheese and sides of skelding bacon. New Lixia became the marketplace of Halfland. The dwarves and halflings Bina had dispatched returned to Unnaskrag, where their exploits were largely met with indifference. That did not prevent them from drinking their pay. But their carousing was short-lived. Inguldrifa sent word to Bina to send them north. She was going to make war on the Geitsmark. Inguldrifa's reasoning was simple. Through her grandchildren, she directed all of the dwarvish mines. She had used gold and spear dwarves to fix the Council of Guildsmen. She thus had control over both the extraction of raw materials and the manufactories. She controlled the trade between Unnaskrag and Cadamos and the halflings living on the south bank of the Silver Stream, but not the commerce with the halflings by way of the Geitsmark and Bensby Bridge. That was in the hands of Halgi, and Halgi had tried to kill her. He had to go. It was a matter both of honour and financial profit. Bina did as he was instructed and sent the troops north, and he accompanied them. He was in need of diversion. And so it was that in the summer of the 166th year of the Common Reckoning, Inguldrifa descended on Geitsbin from the north with the spear dwarves of the Mine Lord, and Bina marched on Geitsbin from the south with his fighting dwarves and halflings. Halgi tried to raise an army, but his folk were reluctant to fight for him. The spear dwarves of the Geitsmark had fought for Halfrid, and they had received scant reward. They expected nothing better of Halfrid's son. And so it was that Halgi fled west to Bensby, and Geitsbin fell to Inguldrifa and Bina, who did not tarry there, but immediately set off in pursuit of Halgi. Halgi gathered what forces he could and marched out to meet them. His counsellors advised him to run, to accept defeat and exile. But Halgi was defiant. "I am the rightful king of the Geitsmark and the Thane of Bensby," he said. "Geitsbin has fallen, but Bensby is mine. I will fight for it. I will triumph or I will die. And if Bensby is lost to me, there is nowhere in the dwarvish lands where I could run to or live in peace. Inguldrifa will be mistress of all." A few miles outside Bensby, the road from Geitsbin passes a small hill, the hill that was afterward known as Halgi's Hill. Here it was that Halgi and his few followers made their final stand, and here it was that they won a famous victory. Inguldrifa fled from the field, and Bina was knocked on the head and captured by Halgi's spear dwarves. Inguldrifa fell back to Geitsbin, from whence she dispatched messengers to Delvings and to Unnaskrag, demanding that reinforcements be sent to her without delay. She also sent a message to Skopti, ordering him to immediately march his spear dwarves to Geitsbin by way of the hill hold. She thus specified Skopti's route to ensure that Ulfgrim was reminded that, although Inguldrifa may have been defeated at Halgi's Hill, she still had many spear dwarves. And then she waited. She expected that Halgi's victory would cause the inhabitants of the Geitsmark to flock to his banners, and he would soon be turning up with an enlarged and aggressive army, spoiling for a fight. She hoped that the assistance that she had summoned would reach her before that army arrived. Halgi and his army did not arrive, but he did send Inguldrifa a letter. In this he stated that he held Bina as his prisoner, and that he would only be released if Inguldrifa immediately withdrew her army from the Geitsmark, swore a solemn oath to never again make war on Halgi or his heirs, and paid a ransom, this last to be delivered to Halgi in the form of a rather large quantity of gold coin. Inguldrifa's reaction to this letter was mixed. She had assumed that Bina was dead. This had grieved her. She was fond of him, and so she was glad to hear that he was alive. But she was angry that Halgi was trying to leverage her affection for her grandson to his own advantage. She was not some weakling who could be blackmailed. But then again, she did not like to think of Bina languishing in chains in a damp dungeon somewhere. However, her concern for Bina's well-being was somewhat ameliorated by her annoyance that the youthful fool had been careless enough to get captured in the first place. She would have been even more annoyed if she had known that Bina was not in fact languishing in a dungeon, but enjoying the freedom of Bensby, entertaining himself with female company and drowning his sorrows in the local dwarvish spirit. To gain these privileges, Bina had given his word that he would not abscond. As Bina was a dwarf of noble blood, Halgi was happy to rely on this promise, and rightly so. Inguldrifa considered her position. Her dislike of Halgi had been exacerbated by his victory at Halgi's Hill and his capture of Bina. Only his total defeat and downfall would satisfy her. The peace terms he had proposed were utterly unacceptable, but she had already expended much of her military resources. She could not afford to lose another battle, so she found another way. At Bensby, the dwarves had built a bridge over the Silver Stream. The vast majority of the trade between the dwarves and the halflings on the far bank passed over that bridge. This trade had made Bensby wealthy. But Bensby Bridge was not the only crossing. Before Bensby Bridge had been built, trade with the halflings had been by way of Drowndaisy Ford. Inguldrifa got to her work. The Council of Guildsmen banned the exports of goods by way of Bensby. Inguldrifa positioned spear dwarves on the road between Geitsbin and Bensby to ensure that this ban was upheld. But no ban was placed on exports by way of Drowndaisy Ford. On the contrary, when Halgi had been ruling in Geitsbin, he had levied duties on all exports to the halflings. Inguldrifa reduced those duties by half, but only if the exports passed over Drowndaisy Ford. The result was that all the trade that had passed over Bensby Bridge now went by way of Drowndaisy Ford. The economy of Bensby collapsed, as did both Halgi's popularity and his ability to raise tax revenue. Rumours began to circulate that Halgi was running out of gold, and that, as before, his soldiery would go unpaid. His army began to dwindle, the levies returning to their civilian life, the spear dwarves leaving to seek employment elsewhere. Halgi had been holding on, hoping that Inguldrifa would accept his terms, or at least open negotiations. It was now clear to him that neither of these things was going to happen. He needed to regain the initiative, and in the spring of the 167th year of the Common Reckoning, he marched his army from Bensby along the southern bank of the Silver Stream, heading upriver toward Drown Daisy Ford.